Welcome back, builders. In today's video we'll be taking the Screaming Demon on a 40-mile round trip with this little 49cc two-stroke. Some of you may remember this bike we tested about 8 months ago with the Southern Customs Hybrid Minarelli, which in my opinion was way too much motor for this frame. I'll explain why later in the video. This will serve as my official review of the Screaming Demon and a little bit of additional information about the 49cc two-stroke. This is only my second 49cc two-stroke, so I'm not very experienced with this particular motor. They're pretty much identical to the 4040s, just scaled down. But I've noticed with this one, and with my first one, at least during the break-in period, they're tricky to start. It takes them a little while to warm up, and they bog down like crazy until they reach operating temperatures. Now, I picked up this little motor from Amazon for about $60 as a motor only, as I already had everything else I needed. Other than the fat belly pipe and the silencer, this is a bone stock 49cc. This one did have a few upgrades over the first one we tested. It has 8mm mounting studs and a G4 style cylinder with open transfer ports. As with every cheap China two-stroke I test, I gave it a once-over before putting it into operation. I took off the jug, and to my surprise, this motor was actually pretty clean. While examining the bottom end, I found a few of the case bolts were loose, so we tightened them up. While doing so, I also found out that this clutch cover bolt was stripped out from the factory, so I had to drill out the case and tap it for a larger bolt. As some of you know, I do not like pre-painted motors. The factory does a terrible job, and you end up with a lot of headaches down the road. To top it off, they actually run hotter. There's some myth going around because people apparently read a magazine from Hardly trying to sell black motors that the black painted motors run cooler, and this is simply not the case, as I've personally tested it and will have a debunk video about it coming soon. The argument is apparently that because it's black, it radiates more heat. But if you're insulating the fins with paint, any positive effect is far outweighed by the insulation. It's essentially saying the same thing as you'll be cooler on a hot day if you wear a sweater so long as it's black. That's not how this works. Anyways, mine's black simply because the black one was the cheapest one available on Amazon at the time. As a matter of fact, I think it was the only one available when I was purchasing the motor. Whether or not there's a style of paint that could help, I do not know. But the paint they use on these motors is certainly not helping. As far as I know, the only thing that might help in a positive way would be black anodizing, as it doesn't add a layer of insulation. And while doing a bit of additional research to look for a specific paint that would help keep things cooler, I actually found contradictory information when looking at things like high temperature header paint, which is specifically used for its insulating properties. The paint used on headers helps keep the heat inside the exhaust and move it out of the engine bay, which pretty much goes against any positive effects that people were claiming that it helps radiate more heat. If any of you know of a specific paint which is supposed to help, let me know down in the comments. If it's not outrageously expensive, I'll try to pick it up and give it a good test. The closest thing I've been able to find so far is acrylic radiator paint, which is mostly just to help prevent corrosion, but doesn't claim to improve in heat dissipation, simply not to interfere with it. Alright, so on to the fun stuff. Let's talk a little bit about the performance of these small 49cc's. Unfortunately, the first motor we bought, well, it fried the crank bearings because the crankshaft was a little too wide and putting way too much pressure against the case. This was an issue that I didn't feel like dealing with, so I just bought a new one. For a full-grown adult, out of the box, both of them had terrible power. Without any modifications on the stock exhaust, it was almost unusable, anything other than flat ground, and it would just slow down to a standstill. Now, it certainly didn't help that the only sprocket I had which would fit onto these mag wheels with the rotor-style adapter is a 36 tooth. Ideally, I would like a 40, which is what I'm going to try to get, or 44 if I have to. The fat belly pipe gave this one just enough power to get me up slight inclines, but prolonged hills are always going to be a problem. Luckily, I still have the top end from my original 49. We did some port work to it and decked the head and gave it a good bit of power. I think combining that jug with this fat belly will make this thing pretty close to a stock triple 40. It's a lot of fun pulling power out of the triple 40s, but it's a real challenge to do it to the 49cc, so I'll see what I can do. This brings us on to why I chose to put the 49cc on the Screaming Demon. Well, having a gas bike frame for your motorized bike build doesn't magically make all your problems go away, and in this particular situation, could make it worse. The F0, or Zeda Dawn, any of the felt faker style frames, which are built quite a bit better, they're a lot beefier than this thing, well, they'll solve a lot of your problems. But the Screaming Demon is the flimsiest gas bike frame I've seen. There's a handful of things that terrify me on this particular bike when carrying a full-grown adult at cruising speeds, but we're going to cover the three main ones. The chainstay and seat stay tubes are really flimsy. These are tiny. Combining that with the fact that they're aluminum just makes it even more scary. These low-quality mag wheels are something I certainly don't trust. There might be good ones out there, but the ones that come with the Screaming Demon are not something I trust. I've seen terrible things happen when these things decide to explode. In a nutshell, cheap magnesium wheels, they're pretty brittle. They're not forgiving, so if you hit something hard enough, they just detonate. Unlike a spoked wheel, which will be a little bit more forgiving due to its flexibility. Also, as we originally found out when first examining this frame, well, you can't true these, which would be fine if they came true out of the box, because then you don't have to worry about it, but these ones didn't. There's a lot of wobble in that rear wheel, and there's nothing I can do about it. And lastly, what's got me the most on this bike is the rear dropouts. These are pretty tiny, and they're aluminum, and I've seen them break on other people's builds. So I'm not putting anything powerful on this bike. I just don't trust it. You combined everything we just talked about with my terrible road conditions, and you can probably understand why I don't like riding this thing fast. So that brings us to why we put the 49cc on this bike. It's a low power motor that runs pretty smooth. These run a little bit smoother than 40s. Less vibration on an aluminum frame should help us in the long run, plus the fact that I'm pretty much running full throttle just to cruise. The lack of power shouldn't let us get into too much trouble. I think this thing tops out at 30 miles an hour, and I'll be moving it to a larger 40-tooth sprocket, which I think will put us right in the sweet spot somewhere around a 28 mile an hour cruising speed, with a little bit more power to climb these slight hills. We talk a lot about putting too much power on a bicycle quite often on the channel, but this is the only build where I've specifically got the weakest motor I could find, so I don't die. At the time of recording, the Screaming Demon and Zeda Dawn V2 both come in at $500 on bicycleengines.com. In my opinion, the Zeda Dawn is a much better and safer option. Now, that bike, at least the one I got, had its own issues. A really flimsy front fork and very loose spokes. Both of those can be dealt with, but at least the frame, the major part of your platform, is sturdy, and they've proven themselves to be quite reliable. For the Zeda Dawn, that's a bike which I consider a good starting platform with a basic motor, but if you're going to put power on it, you need to upgrade the forks and the wheels. You can go one step further and go with the F-Zero from Bikeberry, somewhere around $600 to $700, just depending on when you look at it. But you get better wheels, better tires, be it they're a little wide and you have chain clearance issues, and you get better forks. Though the handlebars and seat are probably something you're going to upgrade immediately on the F-Zero, simply because they're not practical for daily drivers. But it's a better platform if you have a motor that's been modified. My recommendation would be to stay away from the Screaming Demon. Look at the Dawn or the F-Zero. They're much better options. Whereas the gas bike builds do have conveniences, and they look nice, in my opinion, they're not great for beginners. As mentioned earlier, just because you're getting a frame that's designed for a motor doesn't necessarily mean all of your problems are going to be solved. You're still going to run into plenty. I look at gas bike frames as things that you know you're going to upgrade, you just want a decent platform to start with, and the Screaming Demon, in my opinion, is not a decent platform. If you're a new builder looking for a decent platform to start with on your first build, I would recommend avoiding the gas bike frames altogether. Go on Walmart's website, look up the Huffy Lockland, and go with that for your first build. That frame has many conveniences for a beginner, and it's a good cruiser. Just on the Lockland, be sure to remove the fenders, because they can break off and get sucked in between the wheel and the frame, and you'll have a very bad day. As for our little 49cc, it made the entire 40-mile trip without any issues. A lack of power here or there when going up some hills, but no problems. And to add some interest to it, we spent pretty much this entire trip wide open throttle. They can certainly be practical and have a usable amount of power. I just can't recommend them simply because their bigger brothers are $5 to $10 more and give you a noticeable power increase. But if you're somebody who's already done everything you can to a standard China doll, well, these ones can certainly be a challenge. I was curious to see what we can get out of it in the future. Well, I hope you guys got some useful information, or at the very least were mildly entertained. And until next time, ride safe.